Hello and welcome to this live stream. It's a weekly live stream with Zach. It's a new thing. It's not a weekly live stream with Zach, but it's a weekly live stream. And today I have Zach on instead of Warren Drew. I've been on Zach's channel a few times before adhering to Apologetics. You should go check that out. It's a really good YouTube channel, and we do loads of response and discussion videos there as well. But today we're going to be talking a bit more laid back discussion about our Christian journey and also our kind of development and thoughts about apologetics as a whole, along with other questions that you have asked me in the past. So, Zach, how are you today?
I'm good. It's really good to see you, Josh. It's been a while, so I'm really pumped for this conversation. A little sad that Chelsea's out of the Champions League, but doing good. So it's good to see you.
Yeah, I mean, that was a heartbreak. I was watching it at 3 a.m. in the morning, and we were so close. We got up to 3-0, and I thought we were going through to the semifinals, and I was really hot, really happy. And then 5 a.m. in the morning, they score, and then, well, it all went downhill from there. But it was all good. And, well, yeah. It's an absolute roller coaster of emotions. But at least Christian Pulisic has been doing very well for Chelsea, winning us that match against West Ham, I think it was midweek. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it is really crazy. And he's also been doing quite well for the United States men's national team, hasn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm excited. We're in the World Cup, so it should be fun this winter. So, yeah, I'm excited.
That'll be really fun, and I'm definitely looking forward to the World Cup. So perhaps you could get started off with a few of the questions. How can you tell me a bit more about how you became a Christian, or kind of how your story in Christ kind of developed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's interesting because I think a lot of times, like in the evangelical realm that I grew up in, a lot of times you hear kind of like the idea of like, well, I said this prayer and boom, I became a Christian and everything is different, or that's the beginning of my journey. But for me, I don't really have that moment. Like, I mean, I said the sinner's prayer, you do all those things, or raise your hand or stand up and things like that. I did that time and time again growing up. My dad was in ministry and things like that. So, I mean, I've had those moments, and so I always had the kind of like those basic Christian beliefs, like a basic Christian upbringing, but I don't know if it ever really connected between like my head and my heart. It was just kind of like something I did. I don't know. Like maybe I was a Christian then, maybe I wasn't. God only knows. But for me, like things really started to pick up when I was in high school. Heading into my junior year of high school, I was I was convinced of Christianity, but I don't know if I was really living that way. I don't know. But what happened is I had someone I knew in high school after my sophomore year. He recently graduated from high school, so he's 2 years older than me. And all of a sudden, he died in a car crash, single car. So he died in a car crash, and that was the first time in my life where I really started to think about like these big worldview questions really deeply. I was thinking like, well, is he in heaven right now? Like, is there a God? Things like that. And from there, I had like a year of doubting, but not really knowing where to look. I just kind of had these questions, and I had no idea. Like, I didn't know who like William Lane Craig is or anything like that. I remember like I'd be in youth group, and all I really knew about was like the young earth creationist like flavor of Christianity. So I'd be having these questions like, who are Homo erectuses? The Homo erectus, I think that's the correct name for the specimen. And I'd like go to the bathroom during youth group, and they have concert night. And I remember this so vividly, and like reading the Answers in Genesis article. And that was kind of like what I did because I didn't really know where to look. But so that was for about a year. And then heading into my senior year of high school, I had this chance to do like a big senior project for my high school. And I was like, oh, let's just do it on like worldview and things like this. I didn't know apologetics was a word at the time. So I dived into this project and then read mostly Christian stuff, but also looked at like and interacted with like atheist things and Islamic and Judaism and other religions. And from that, I became really convinced that Christianity was true. And since then, my views have changed a lot, and I've had different ideas, but I've just really stayed firm in that conviction that Christianity is true. And from there, I've really grown in my Christian life and walk really since probably like my senior year of high school. And yeah, that's kind of been my story. Started this channel as part of that senior project, or not this channel, but my channel. And yeah, keep going now. It's been 3 years or so 4 years almost. So yeah, it's my story.
That's definitely very interesting. I never knew about kind of like the Christian upbringing / young earth creationist environment. And perhaps I'm very curious about this young earth creationist environment because I suppose I never really grew up in that same kind of pathway myself in Hong Kong. Of course, I grew up in a Christian family and all of that, but I never really understood, or at least reached out or know that much of the young earth creationists, though I do hear more of that from kind of Christian pastors and people I interact with. So kind of perhaps one of the biggest questions I have is, where do you think this young earth creationist kind of view or belief comes from, and do you think it holds a very strong part in the church? Is it a main part of the church, or kind of how does that interact with kind of mainstream Christianity today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's gonna depend on the church you go to. I mean, for me, like growing up in like the church, it wasn't really like a big deal. Like I didn't really know the different like ideas about like God creating the earth, like in earth creationism or like theistic evolution or anything like this until I was in high school. Like even like when I do like basic like we did a basic apologetic course at one time before I even knew it was like the actual word for it, and like it didn't even talk about that from my memory. This was when I was in like ninth grade or so. But then later along, like there'd be some people like in my church or my community that would super be like pushing this like young earth creationist model. And I think that's probably how I got into it. And I never really was like a card carrying like young earth creationist, but it was definitely the only like form of apologetics I knew of. Like I didn't know of like actual like arguments for the existence of God or the resurrection. I just kind of knew, I was like, oh, like the people saying the earth is 6,000 years old versus like the other people. So that was kind of what I first got into when I kind of ran into this debate, because that was just the only thing I knew. And why that was the case, I don't know. And then I think with the churches, it just depends on your church. If you go to some churches, I think the YEC model is super prominent. They're going to push it a lot. And if you go to other churches, it's not really talked about. And it's kind of more like what you were saying, Josh, where it's like, it's something, but it's not really like a big deal with our model of creation. Just knowing that like we can say that God created the earth and holding to things like original sin, we're fine. So it just depends on where you are. Obviously, America's a really big country with a lot of different views. So yeah.
Do you think one of the reasons why it, in some places, it becomes a bigger issue was in some sense a result of kind of the new atheist, I'm just thinking Richard Dawkins' critique of young earth creationists, or at least that strand of Christianity? Because it does seem, at least in kind of the more like early church fathers, the idea of a 6,000-year-old earth or like a longer earth never really was a huge part of their philosophy or their thoughts. They do raise it a bit, of course, but it does seem to suggest that, or at least it appears to me, that the emphasis on young earth creationism has grown exponentially over the last years, even though it does seem quite weird thinking about it in that sense. Do you think there's perhaps one of that is kind of more of a response to new views that people view as kind of heresies or whatever it is?
Yeah, that could definitely be possible. I mean, I'm not super well versed in the history of like young earth creationism and how it kind of like exploded, but it's definitely a big deal now. And a lot of times they'll be talking about people, and especially in like the intelligent design movement, you'll hear things from like the idea of like attacking like a Darwinian model of evolution rather than like other models. So I think that like that's definitely something that is prominent, and maybe it's the new atheists that do that. Maybe it's other people. I'm not really sure because I haven't really like dived deep into it. I do know like obviously over the past like 100 years or so, it's become a really big deal. Like going back to the Scopes monkey trial in the early 1900s, I think it was. There's creationism 100 years ago. It's a big deal. So I think really, yeah, it's been growing and growing, and I don't know where it's at now. It probably depends on the church. I think it's declining, but I don't know for sure. I don't have the studies or anything.
I mean, it is quite similar. There was quite an interesting thing, because I think my journey is quite similar to yours in the sense that I actually didn't start off with kind of these proving the existence of God kind of apologetics, but mainly focusing on biblical kind of discussions. And I grew up watching James White and some of his debates, and though I have to admit I'm not a Calvinist, I don't believe in like some of the Calvinist teaching, though I do actually grew up, I came to understand, or at least I got into kind of this debate philosophy theology kind of discussion through the James White discussions on kind of, there was some on predestination, there was some on the papacy, and those I found were very, very interesting. I suppose I grew up more in a kind of a Protestant Baptist environment, and as a result I had that kind of, I was always interested in the different views of Christianity, especially kind of Catholicism, because I never really understood Catholicism, and everyone's like, why on earth do they kind of believe in certain things? Though over time, I've slowly grown, I would say, probably a bit more appreciation for the Catholic tradition. Though it does seem that everyone on YouTube seems to be moving towards Catholicism. Like Cameron Bertuzzi seems to be posting like, I'm becoming a Catholic soon, or whatever he's doing like almost every other week. But it is one of those things where I suppose how I moved from the, I would say, more biblical focus to kind of proving the existence of God. I actually don't really know how that kind of occurred. It just seemed to naturally stem from watching one William Lane Craig debate, and then that kind of changed the perspective a bit. Was there any kind of like moment that you think, well, okay, we're moving away from kind of the young earth creationist discussion to maybe directly jumping into the proving God's existence and all those other discussions, which of course occurs a lot on your channel where you discuss those ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we're moving away from just like that, because I know, like, for example, there's some people that I know in my life that were really, they weren't really pushing like young earth creations, but that's where they were. And they listened to some of the work of Joshua Swamidass. He's on some podcast, and they listened, and it opened up to this whole world of, hey, there's a bunch of different views where we can have all these like traditional Christian doctrines that we want, like original sin and like Adam and Eve being created or not ex nihilo, but like out of the dust and things like this, and also being fine with like an old earth model or an evolutionary model. So I think things like that are making people more open. So I think that's progressing towards, and more voices are like pushing these things out. And for me, like, I try not to push a specific model, just to say that I just like to say that everything, like anything that can hold like a basic like Nicene Creed, and we can keep things like original sin, and Adam, like historical Adam and Eve, like there's a bunch of different views that can do that, and it's not just like a YEC model. So I mean, that's kind of where I would go, and I think that's where the church is progressing.
So after you became a Christian, or at least kind of focus more on Christian teachings within your life, how do you think that has changed or impacted how you live and how you've interacted with others?
Just like understanding, like growing in like teachings like Christian, like apologetics and theology and stuff. Okay, yeah. It's interesting because like for me, my journey is kind of one where I like to try to do it on my own. Like I've always been like an independent, go get it done, do things, overachiever. Like that's just kind of like who I am for whatever reason. So that's definitely like my challenge, is like as a Christian, like trying to like realize that like I can't do it all on my own. I've been reading Martin Luther recently. I've been reading his the book where he responds to Erasmus. I'm totally blanking on the name right now. And one of the things he talks about is this idea that like our salvation is like totally independent of like us and what we do. Like it's fully God. And why I might not buy into like his deterministic, like Calvinistic model, I do think there's something right about that. Like my salvation, like it isn't based on me. It's based off of what God did on the cross. And I couldn't do anything about that. So it's helped me realize that like I can't do it on my own. Like that faith, that idea of like trusting in God and living and trying to live in accordance to his will. Like that's all I can do. I can't really do, and Luther would go a lot more extreme than me and say really can do nothing. I think, but so that's, for me, that's kind of the big thing, is realizing that like as Christians, like we got to have like faith in Christ and him can be our sufficiency, and trust in him, knowing that we can't do it on our own. So that for me in my Christian journey, that's probably been my biggest thing, as I've been learning about these things and trying to figure all that out. 'Cause it's definitely a big challenge.
That's definitely something which I think that idea of doing it on your own to not doing it on your own is just so important, because at least in my kind of walk with Christ, I used to be very kind of or at least I believed I was very self-sufficient, and that never really ends up very well. If you go back and think about kind of some stuff in your life, you're like, well, I perhaps could have been a bit more introspective, or I could have perhaps been a bit more kind of focused on the fact that I don't have everything under control, and that kind of trust in God and that belief in God was very important in the development of my Christian faith and how I interact with others. And perhaps developing on this is like, what do you think is the role of apologetics, and how has that kind of interacted with our Christian belief? Because of course, a lot of times, or at least you sometimes hear on YouTube, some people are like, oh, some church pastors are like really disliking apologetics, and other people are saying, oh, it's a really, really good thing. How do you think those two lie together, and kind of how do they interact with each other?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think it's a good thing. I don't think every single person needs to know like a Kalam cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument off the top of their heads. So I wouldn't go that far. I do think it's helpful. Like for me, the way I think about it is that like if Christianity is true, meaning like the resurrection of Jesus and God's existence like correspond to the actual world, then I think there'd be good reasons to think that these things are true. And I see apologetics as kind of like discovering these reasons. So like I don't think there has to be like an airtight, perfect case for the resurrection. But it seems like historically there's a pretty good case that you can make. And the question kind of is like, well, are miracles possible? Like I like how Philip Goff put it in a tweet. He talked about how the historical case is good, but for him, the chances of like a miracle happening just like destroy the case for the resurrection. And for me, there's something right to that. Obviously, like I'd put the prior a lot higher than, but for me, like if Christianity is true, we should see reasons around the world to kind of think that it's like actually true. And that's when I see like the role of like natural theology, when we're building like a case for God, or like the case of the resurrection. We can see like, hey, look, there's these good reasons to think that this is actually true. This faith that happens, tradition is still here. Like there's a good reason to think it's true. So for me, apologetics is kind of, that's its function, is to kind of show like, hey, it's true. So with regards to like the role it plays in the church, I mean, I think that it's good to know these things. I don't think it's absolutely necessary. Like, I don't think we're going to get quizzed when we get up to heaven and be like, hey, did you know, like, Richard Swinburne, can you summarize his case for God? But I do think that like it's important, because if it's true, at least for me, like I want to know it's true, and I want to try to study and read the best of both sides and really see like these experiences that I've had, do they match up with like the actual world? So for me, that's kind of how I see it.
Perhaps naturally building on that, what do you think is the goal of apologetics? Is it purely aimed towards maybe proving the existence of God, or do you think there are other kind of sub goals or other features of apologetics which may also be very, very important as well?
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Perhaps it's more like, well, what do you think is the goal of apologetics? Like, it, of course, it kind of proves the existence of God, but do you think it serves any other purpose as well, in the sense that maybe, because of course I sometimes think about apologetics and I look at all these debates, a lot of times I come to the conclusion that rarely when people actually debate or discuss the existence of God, at least in an apologetic sense, neither of the debate partners or the debate kind of pair, neither of them really kind of come to actually change your views or anything like that. And I'm not really sure whether that's merely just a lack of kind of communication, or just there are always going to be other objections and rebuttals that people could think of on the side, or do you think that apologetics is really there to maybe convert other people, or is it mainly just more of a Christian defense of atheist rebuttals instead of, okay, Christianity is true, you guys should be Christian? Do you think perhaps it's more of, is it a form of evangelism, or is it more a form of kind of the preservation of faith?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. To me, it's both. So I think like when you look at like the word of like apologetics, like it just means like defending Christianity. And for me, if that's all you're going to go by, like that's fine. But for me, like as I see myself as like a Christian, and I guess as an apologist, it's more than that. For me, it's like an exploration of truth. Like hopefully for like me and you and anyone listening to this, truth is the most important thing that like we can discover. So I think that when we look at like the role of apologetics and like its purpose, it's to discover truth. It's to really test this idea of Christianity and see like, hey, does it really stand up to the world? Like, do we have like a good reason to think for the resurrection or God's existence? So for me, that's what I see. So then I think in one sense, like if Christianity is true, there should be good arguments for it and good defenses for it. So yeah, I mean, if I'm defending the faith, I'm an apologist. And if I think there's good defenses, then I think it's true. So I think it can be like a sense of like defending the faith from rejections, but also evangelism, because we can say like, hey, bro, look up. There's a good chance that like this is true. You should look at this case and see this and how it matches with like what we see in the world. So for me, I see it as kind of both. It's this idea of like looking at the world holistically in pursuit of truth. And if Christianity is true, then like, yeah, we should be Christian apologists for it, because like we see it as the most plausible way of explaining the world. So that's kind of how I see things.
Perhaps developing on that as well, where do you think that apologetics crosses over from theology, crosses over with theology? Do you think they should be mixed together, or should they be seen as kind of two different things? Because a lot of times people will be like, okay, this person isn't very good at kind of their theology, or this guy's getting their theology all messed up, or this apologist is very good at some parts of his theology, but he's quite poor in other parts of theology. Where do you think those two kind of fields?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And when you sent this to me, it got me thinking a lot. One thing I was thinking about is I read Graham Oppy and Kenny Pierce's debate book on God's existence over the winter. And it's really interesting because they're debating, and like Kenny's bringing his model of God and Oppy's bringing his like arguments against God. And at the end of the book, in Oppy's last like closing statement, what he does is he's like, at one point he's like, I'm disappointed that Kenny didn't bring in all his theology into this debate, like his ideas about like demons, ghosts, afterlives, all these different things. And for me, like reading what Oppy said there, kind of like it made sense to me. I was like, yeah, like as a Christian, like I should explain my whole worldview, not just like the parts, and keep it minimal. So in one sense, like I do have like a holistic worldview. Like I have an idea on like what I think angels are, or what I think the afterlife's like, or like the eschaton, like the premillennial, postmillennial, all that stuff. Like I have an idea of it. But then again, for me, it's like arguing for a mere Christianity is kind of my main idea. So like, for example, if we're going to talk about God's existence, we should also talk about like God as a Trinity. It's kind of the way I see things, because like, you know, you can believe in God, but if you don't believe in a Trinity, then you're not really a Christian. And my interests are not just getting you to like bare theism, but getting you to like Christianity. So for me, like when I see like looking at like apologetics and theology, it's arguing for like a basic like Nicene Creed. Like if we can get like the death and resurrection of Christ, the Trinity, things like that, that's really important to me. obviously I don't want to I don't spend a lot of time on my channel I don't spend any time defending like my view of like the eschaton or things like that, because I don't think that's like a mere Christianity. So for me, defending a mere Christianity is super important. So I don't think the other topics are wait, let me be careful here. I think there are just as important understanding these other theological topics, but for my purposes and like what I'm trying to do, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, because for me, it's like, well, we can disagree on these things and both be Christians and we're cool. So that's kind of the way I see things, is defending those things that are kind of like essential to the Christian faith, like God's existence, the resurrection, the Trinity, things like that.
And that's one of the things which I definitely agree with you. And there's always that kind of part of me, which I think in the back of the mind, where I'm like, a lot of times I focus on these apologetics arguments or proving this mere Christianity, that I sometimes figure out or find my understanding of other kind of parts of the Christian faith somewhat lacking to almost an embarrassing level, considering how much, or not how much I know, but rather just in proportion to the amount of in proportion to what I know about maybe apologetics, my knowledge about some part of Revelation, or some, as you say, even to some degree, the Trinity is perhaps a bit kind of almost embarrassingly little. And in some sense, how do you think you can find a balance, or do you think it's possible, or should we be striving to find a balance between those other kind of questions as well when it comes to apologetics?
You mean like the difference between like essential like doctrines and like non-essential?
Yeah. And do you think go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say, I think we're all called to different things. Like if someone finds their calling to study like the different views on like the millennium or things like that, like good for them. Like I don't really have a problem with that. I don't think it's like bad to study these things. It's just for me, like my purpose is thinking about like my goals. Like my goal with this channel is to really try to like argue for Christianity and try to show like, hey, there's good reasons to think Christianity is true, and do it like lovingly, and show like, hey, like what's true is more important to me than just defending something. So like if I'm showing that I'm wrong, okay, great. It's gonna be hard to switch my views, but I'll do it if I can be shown otherwise. So for me, with the goal of my channel, it's like defending like a mere Christianity, a basic Christianity. So that's why for me, defending these other like doctrines that aren't essential is not super important. But I mean, for other people, like if that's what they feel like they're supposed to do, great. Because I think those things are just as important. Like having a good Christian understanding of different sub-doctrines, like maybe like the method of atonement or things like that. Like those are super important topics, and we need to think about those. If that's what you feel like you're supposed to do, then good, great. I have no problem with that. Like for example, like like you have the big classical theism, neo-classical theism debate, and it's like that's a really important thing to think about, like the nature of God. And you can have different views and still hold like a basic Christianity, like understanding God's nature. Like that's super important to do. So for me, that's kind of how I see it, is we're just all called to different things. So yeah.
How do you think we separate these essential and non-essential doctrine? Of course, we could say, well, let's look at the Nicene Creed. It kind of lays out what's essential, and you can say everything else is non-essential. But how do you think the Nicene Creed kind of draws? Do you think we should follow the Nicene Creed's definition, or do you think that as time changes, perhaps what is essential and non-essential might not be fully kind of restricted to the Nicene Creed in some sense? Because if you look at maybe the existence of Satan or the devils, that might seem perhaps quite essential to some people as well. Where do you think the line is drawn? And do you think it's important that a line is even drawn between the two? Or could we just say, well, it isn't very clear exactly where that line is, and it just doesn't really matter what's essential and what's not, to some degree?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely a challenge. So I would say that I always like to start with maybe the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed or something like that, because that'll kind of get the fundamental grasp. So I like to think about it what do I have to believe to be a Christian? So you get the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the incarnation, some sense of probably atonement, the Trinity, things like that. And for me, that's your big, if you think about it like a target, there's your bullseye, there's your center things that you have to believe. And you can't really change it. You probably you can't believe that God's not triune and probably be a traditional Christian. So for me, drawing that center bullseye target, these are the things you have to do. And those are the things I'm probably most interested in. And then you can maybe draw a second thing around it. Yeah, these things are really important. Maybe you can have different beliefs and still be Christians. But it's just important to have these things maybe your question of we're adding maybe historical persons. Though some people would argue that would be in the bullseye, and that's where it gets tricky. So there's definitely that hard thing of trying to understand, what should be in the bullseye. And I don't have all the answers. That's why I'd like to stick to a creed or something like that. So, I mean, that's my thing. It's kind of a cop-out saying stick to the creeds, but for me, that's kind of where I'm at right now, is looking at like a Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, because I think that's like the simplest expositions of like the fundamental tenets of the Christian tradition and faith.
This definitely leads us to the next question, which is what is the role and the differences between denominations? Because, of course, one of the things which between essential and non-essential doctrines, some things which a certain and I really don't want to sound like I'm picking on Catholicism here, but like things like the infallibility of the Pope or the implications of apostolic succession and other Catholic beliefs, to some might be viewed as something which is very significant or very essential. Like I know I talked to some of the Protestants in my church, and they're like, well, how on earth could you possibly believe that someone else is infallible? There's another source of infallibility apart from the scriptures. It seems to me that without that kind of source, or without that kind of belief, or in fact with that belief in, I suppose, it would be with a belief in the infallibility of the Pope, it almost becomes a form of heresy. So it does seem to suggest that there's certain forms of denominations which would view other forms of denominations as heretical, almost to the degree that someone might view modalism as a form of heresy as well. So where do you think that distinction would lie, and kind of how do different denominations interact with each other?
Yeah, I mean, heresy is obviously a big word, and it's something that I don't like to just throw around like aimlessly. So for me, I think about like the bullseye again. So let's just go back to the bullseye. Like if we can agree on things like the death and resurrection of Christ, the Trinity, the incarnation, those basic bullseye things, then I'd say like, well, we're Christians, and we may have different views on like maybe say like the papacy. Like I'm not a Catholic, and I'm not like thinking about becoming a Catholic. I have like very major problems with Catholicism. But like, so if we draw like that, if we can agree on that bullseye, then like, I'd say like, we're Christians. We're Christians together, and maybe we have like very different beliefs and very different ideas on a bunch of different other topics, but like we can still be Christians and love each other, and agree to like a priesthood of all believers. It's kind of like to think about it. It's like for me, when I think about different denominations, like if we can agree on the bullseye, that's great, good. And we can have these discussions, but like I think recognizing that is super important, of kind of figuring out like what are those fundamental tenets of Christianity. And one disadvantage for Protestants is like we don't have like dogmas or like infallible traditions to kind of hash these things out. Sola Scriptura. So I think that like trying to hold on to that bullseye is super important, is kind of the way I see things, and figuring that out is definitely the challenge. But I think if we can have that figured out and look at like the creeds and things like that, then, we can have this idea that like denominations, you have different views. We can still like have worship and fellowship together.
Perhaps turning to one of the questions in the chat, which one of these fundamental bullseye beliefs do you think is the most important one, or do you think they should all be seen as kind of the same importance?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd say all, like whatever the bullseye is, you need to have all of them. Because if you don't, like if you believe in the death and resurrection of Christ, but don't believe in like the incarnation, that's not really Christianity, I would say. So I wouldn't say like there's a most important one. Obviously, you need the death and resurrection of Christ to get anything going. Because if there's no resurrection, then I don't know how you're going to defend Christianity at all. So that might be the most fundamental thing, and then you kind of derive things like the Trinity and the incarnation from that. Is kind of what I would say. But I'd say to be Christian, you need all the bullseye beliefs. Is kind of how I would see things.
So you've been doing this kind of apologetics for quite a long time now. Out of all of them, what do you think is the biggest challenge towards Christian faith that you've heard or come across?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think there's two different ways of thinking about this. One is the philosophical, like probably some version of like the problem of evil. Obviously, there's a lot of good arguments from evil and a lot of questions. Built like animal suffering or like infant death or things like that. So for me, that's probably the biggest like philosophical challenge. But for me, the biggest thing that has me thinking is the idea of like Christians living morally stagnant lives. So like for me, I think of Christianity, I'm like, well, yeah, it's true. So like we should be transformed then as Christians and like live like good lives of transformation. But like you run into most people, and myself included, we're pretty normal. We're not super special or different or things like that. So I think that's really a big challenge that we don't really think about a lot, is like, why are we just like everyone else, just living our lives, not really living like this thing's actually true? And like, sure, we do some things differently, but a lot of the times we're pretty much like the rest of the world. And maybe I'm a little too pessimistic here, but for me, that's kind of how I see things. Is just like Christians seem pretty typical for the world. So for me, I wrestle with that a lot. So it's a big challenge for me.
Do you think that this kind of separation between kind of morally stagnant lives and perhaps the expectation, do you think that could be almost mirrored upon the kind of the idea of not all, I don't think this is a direct quote verbatim, but something along the lines of, not everyone who says Father, Father will enter the kingdom of heaven, or something along the lines of not everyone who claims to be a Christian is actually a Christian. Do you think that might be that formulation might be a bit too extreme for this kind of form of morally stagnant lives? Or do you think that morally stagnant lives is more just, well, okay, I'm making one change or one change, but not really a full complete 180 turn?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's part of it. Obviously, like there's people that would say like they're Christians, but you have that verse that you just mentioned, Josh, which seems to suggest otherwise. So I definitely think that's part of it. Another thing I think of is like sin. Like even though like I'm a Christian and I'm saved by Christ and I'm trying to grow in sanctification, like I'm still going to sin. I'm going to mess up. I'm going to leave this interview and I guess we're doing something else after this. And after that, I'm going to mess up today. I'm going to get some stuff wrong and make some mistakes. So for me, like it's that idea that like the mistakes are still going to happen. They're going to keep going. So I think for me, my biggest like kind of response to that would be the idea of like, hey, we're still sinners. We're still human beings. But hopefully we're progressing. Like I'd like to think that like as a Christian, like over the past like year or month or even few days, I've grown in my walk. I haven't gone further away. So for me, I'd kind of point to the idea of like, well, we're still sinners, progressing. We got a long ways to go. But that's kind of how I would answer that question, is if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was reading a part of Paradise Lost recently, and I've been thinking about reading it for a very long time, but I've gotten my hands on it, and it's very, very difficult prose for me to understand, or at least I felt the blank verse was very difficult for me to kind of get the message of. But one of the interesting things which kind of I was reminded of when you just said that was the idea of Satan. And the thing is that when you read Paradise Lost, well, I think William Blake read Paradise Lost and said that Milton was almost a Satanist because he was a undercover Satanist because he kind of put Satan in a very, very good light. There's almost this idea in Paradise Lost where humans are given this kind of opportunity, and God has precisely given humans this freedom to do good and evil, even though he knows that humans will do evil despite the fact of them knowing what is good. And in some sense, perhaps humans, even when they become Christian, in some sense, do not understand or are not fully understanding of the significance of God's evil, because it seems that if God fully showed himself, and I think that there's a phrase in Paradise Lost, let me find the quote, I have it next to me. It says, but still, referring to God, but still his strength concealed, which tempted our attempt and wrought our fall. Henceforth his might we know and know our own. It seems to suggest that, in some sense, the fact that we don't fully understand this strength and significance of God seems to lead to some sense of suffering or some sense of sin, because it's written that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all evil. And in some sense, I think that's one of the things that the Old Testament gets quite right, is that it emphasizes the wrath of God, and perhaps in some sense that wrath of God and the fact that God is actually all powerful and does have all control is something which is often gone undercover, or at least ignored by modern Christians, because most of the time you go to a sermon, or at least in a lot of sermons I see online, it's like, oh, God is love, God is kindness, God forgives, and all those things. And when you forget that God actually is all powerful and is actually a righteous person who will judge sin, you then forget about the significance of your sin, and in some sense you're not promoted that much to do evil or do good all the time, and you sometimes can slip up easier. And something for me, when I just kind of look back at the times where I fall into sin a lot, it's when I don't remember kind of the strength and the power of God, and I sometimes forget that, and then lead to kind of more moral failings and stuff.
Yeah, I think there's something really right about that, Josh. I'm glad you brought it up. I think it kind of goes into like, I know you've done a lot of stuff with Peterson recently. He always talks about the idea that like the guards at Auschwitz were pretty normal human beings. And they had this capacity with them for like great evil. In the horrific conditions that was like fully exercised. And I think recognizing that is super important. Like, and I think it's helpful in answering this question is like, yeah, well, sure, I'm a Christian and I'm progressing better and I'm getting better every day, but man, I got a long ways to go. I think very rarely do you wake up one day and you got everything going wrong, and then the next day everything's going right. It's going to take a long way, and it's a journey. And it's something I've been realizing even the past few weeks is it's just one day at a time. Each day, take a step and try to grow a little bit more, and slowly but steadily we can grow. But like recognizing the reality of like the sin within us, is super important because we recognize like, yeah, whew, I got a lot going wrong with me. And I think that's the beauty of Christ is like, hey, we have freedom in knowing that we can grow and we can keep messing up and that love's still there. But like that growth is super important as well. So that's kind of how I would see that.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps one of the last questions would be the relationship between Christian and non-Christian works. Because of course, I sometimes get asked a lot of questions in my comments where they're like, well, should we be reading things like Harry Potter or things which have kind of references to Greek gods in them? And initially, I never really understood that objection, I suppose, though it does seem to come up quite commonly in the sense that, oh, you shouldn't read things about witchcraft, or you shouldn't read about other kind of concepts which seem to be unholy or unbiblical. Have you interacted with that view before, and have you heard a lot about it? Because I definitely have never really interacted with that strand of Christianity.
I haven't really interacted with like witchcraft or anything like that at all. I mean, I have read different like religious texts. Like I've read the Book of Mormon, I've read the Quran, read different texts like that. Read some like atheistic works. So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it. Obviously, like if you're a Christian, you start practicing a different religion, then yeah, there's something really wrong about that. But like I think like reading like non-Christian works, like I see that as fine. Well, it depends on what it is. So if you're reading, and it depends why you're reading it. So for example, like I read the Quran out of curiosity of trying to understand Islam. And I don't think there's anything like inherently sinful about trying to understand a different religion. Obviously if I start practicing it, yeah, that's the big problem. It's a really big problem. So for example, again, like I think you could read Harry Potter. I've never read Harry Potter, though I hopefully will at some point. Like I read a bunch of like non-Christian fiction. Like I've read like The Hunger Games or like Dune or things like this. And it's definitely not all Christian. But I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it unless you're kind of reading it to like try to like sin. Like if you're looking at it as some sort of outlet to sin, then yeah, there's a big problem with that. And there's obviously a line. Like I don't think we should be watching like really like explicit content. Like I think there's a line, but I don't see anything like inherently wrong with like interacting with non-Christian works. But then again, I think it's going to be important, like as you're interacting with these works, ask yourself like, why are you doing this? So like for me right now, like I'm reading like Edward Gibbon's The Fall of Rome, and he's very blatantly like not a Christian. And like I just finished a section where he's talking about how Christians have like exaggerated persecutions. And he says like we combine like all the persecutions in the early church, there's still nothing compared to like even like what Protestants have happened to Protestants in the past like few years, is what Gibbons would say. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Like I'm allowed to read criticism of Christianity because my goal isn't to just like try to like destroy Christianity. My goal is just to try to understand him and his worldview a little bit more. And I think that's something good to do. So I'd say like ask yourself when you're acting with like movies, books, anything like that, why are you doing this? Are you using this as an outlet for like sinful desires, or are you using this to like have greater understanding? That's the question. And there's blurry lines. It's not all clear, but that's kind of my general approach to thinking about it.
I definitely agree with you. And I think that there's always going to be this line you have to draw with, well, what is your intention? Because it seems that you could, even if you're reading only Christian works as well, if you have a poor intention when you're actually reading those works as well, that can also similarly lead to horrible, or not horrible, but unfortunate outcomes as well. And perhaps there's also this other question in the chat of how much of the Bible should be understood literally, because of course this is always something which comes up, especially since we've talked about young earth creationism before. What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, Again, I'm not really like a Bible expert or anything like that. So I wouldn't like have the qualifications really answer this question fully. I would just say that like, once again, think about that bullseye. Once you have those bullseye, like you should read the death and resurrection of Christ, literally. You should read the idea that like God incarnated, literally. God is three persons, literally. And then look at the advice of scholars. Like if all the Bible scholars agree on a certain passage, like this is a literal thing, then yeah, there's good reason to believe it. If there's debate, then, well, I think you could probably go on either side. If everyone says that this passage shouldn't be read literally, then you probably shouldn't read it literally either. So for me, that's kind of how I do it, is following the consensus of scholars. Because I think that's a good way to go when you're not sure. Obviously, don't just like blindly follow whatever the PhD priesthood says. But I mean, that's kind of how I would see things. So I don't really have the qualifications to say like, oh, 42.58% of the Bible should be read literally. So that's kind of my thoughts.
Definitely. And that's something which I always find, this is one of the things where I sometimes feel quite badly about. Not, I wouldn't say morally badly or anything like that. There's sometimes, because I do have a few kids, maybe Benji knows about it, Benjamin Chin in the chat, who's also in my school. Sometimes I interact with some of the younger students and they always ask me questions about Christianity. And one of the things I'm like, well, you can read certain things as analogies and stuff like, and not literally. Though then the question comes up is like, well, if I start reading certain parts of the Bible in the same way that I'm approaching maybe a work of Dostoevsky or something like that, there does seem to be at least something intuitively kind of like, I wouldn't say degrading the Bible to the level of what Dostoevsky's Demons or The Idiot of Brother Karamazov, like degrading it to that level. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily degrading either, though. There's some idea of if you're I suppose at least there's some intuitive kind of objection, at least when it says, well, the moment you stop reading it literally, it's almost taken down a notch. And that's what some people suggest, though. So it's one of those things which I'm still thinking about. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have Crime and Punishment on my bookshelf. I just haven't gotten to it yet. My goal is to get there this summer. So I don't know. I mean, it's a challenge of like how much of the Bible is clear that we can understand and how much is going to be left up to debate. So like, should we read the Bible thinking about like what Dostoevsky says? Probably not. But I think we could read Dostoevsky thinking about what the Bible says and kind of like where his ideas are coming from, because Dostoevsky is very Christian in his writings, from what I understand. So, I mean, that's kind of what I would say, if that makes sense. Maybe I'm not fully answering your question. Obviously, like if you're trying to mold the Bible into your view, you're doing something wrong. But I mean, if you look at the biblical truth and you come to different things, like, and you can find these things in other later works, then yeah, that's great. Like, I don't really see a problem with it. And again, like, if Christianity is true, I think we're going to find signs of that everywhere. Like whether it's like literature, art, philosophy, science, that's kind of how I see things.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps for the last question is what do you think, or the second last question is what do you think is the best argument for God's existence?
Yeah, so if you've been following my channel, you know I've, over the past few years, you can see this in how the videos have changed. I've progressed away from just like deductive arguments like the Kalam. Like if you go back way back when to like my first debates or things like that, that's kind of what I do. Now I think the best kind of approach is like a Swinburnian approach, where you look at the ideas of like, hey, like look how like the theism versus atheism, and look at it kind of like the ideas of like the nature of simplicity, and look at it the nature of like what does the world look better like. So I think that's the best approach to trying to think about like arguing for God's existence. In terms of a specific argument, I would say it just it's a challenge, because I think there's a bunch of good arguments. I would say Christianity intuitively makes sense of the world. I think when we think about just on our intuition from like a theistic view where life has like meaning, purpose, things like this, I think it makes a lot more sense than an atheistic view where there's no meaning, no purpose, things like that. I know my atheist friends, if they listen, they'll be like, Zach, come on, dude. You know, atheists say that like life has can have purpose and moral realism and these things, like given atheism. Like, I'm not willing to like say, well, that's impossible, but it just seems like theism just is a better explanation. So for me, I think the intuitiveness of theism just makes a lot of sense of the world. Like you think about it, most people over time have believed in the existence of God or some sort of like supreme or ultimate reality. Very few people over time have said like there is no God or things like that. So I think that intuition that we naturally have, like there's good biological research to show that we do have this intuition. There's a really good reason to think that there is a God and some sort of like meaning, purpose in the world. It's kind of probably my best argument, I would individually say, though I would never just do that. I'd have to try to make like a cumulative case is what I think.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree with you. And I do think that kind of like the overall explanatory scope of theism is perhaps, at least I would agree, is one of the greatest argument for the existence of God. And perhaps end off this live stream, what are your 3 or 5 or what are the core Christian books or non-Christian books that you'll recommend everyone to read?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me pull it up on my website right now, because I have a list, because I always get asked this question. So if you go to hereinapologetics.com, shameless plug right there. I have 68 or so books you should read, which I need to update. So my top books, I really like How Reason Can Lead to God by Josh Rasmussen. It's a really good book, just trying to like arguing for the existence of God. So that's really good. Is There a God by Richard Swinburne, a short, like abbreviated version of his work. Really good argument for God. Really love Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Really get to like the fundamental tenets of like, here's Christianity, here's what we're trying to do. So that's like a Christian, like arguing for the resurrection. I haven't really found anything yet that I really, really like. I'm kind of on the fence about the minimal facts approach. I just haven't studied it enough. I think the best argument for the resurrection is going to be something that looks at like simplicity and explanatory power. And I haven't really read a lot on that. So that's kind of to be determined. And then Christian life, there's some good books out there. I really like, there's a few. So I really like The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Great book. I have to reread it. It's been a while. Desiring God. I really love John Piper's work, even though I'm not a Calvinist. And yeah, those are some of my biggest ones, I would say. I think reading The History of the Church by Eusebius is a good thing to do. Just trying to understand like Christian history. Like I've been diving into the fathers more recently. because Christianity hasn't just existed for 100 years. Like, I've been trying to like dive into the past 1900 years of Christian history more. And the best book above all is Christianity for All by Joshua Yen. So that's my take.
I think that's definitely a very, very good list of books, and perhaps on my side, I'll just recommend kind of 3 books. I have to admit, my reading on apologetics also hasn't been as crazy. I started off, because like when I was reading, it's quite funny. I started off kind of with the Calvinist Catholicism, a bit of that, read a bit of that. Then I went off to a bit of William Lane Craig. But before I got too far into that, I kind of completely went, because I had a project come up, so I completely did a 180, then went into Russian existentialism, and did that for like the longest amount of time in existentialism. So I think I could only talk about those books in the sense that that's kind of like the field which I know the most of. Though I would recommend Dostoevsky and Interpretation for anyone to read. I think it's a very, very beautiful work, and it's a very deep, not deep, but it's a very simple but also beautiful explanation of Dostoevsky's works. And after that, just read any work of Dostoevsky, and that's kind of just my recommendation for anyone here. And of course, I think one of William Lane Craig's kind of like basic, one of his books. What's his book called? On Guard or something like that. It's quite helpful if anyone just like never knew anything about apologetics. And some people ask me, well, what's a book you'll give me if I knew nothing about apologetics before? I'll say that's perhaps one of the first books I'll point someone to. So those are kind of it for the questions. I will indeed I might answer some of the questions in the chat in another video. I know a few of them, like the idea of whether God is limiting or not. I do plan to make a video on that in the future, so make sure you stay up to date on that. Also, make sure you go check out Zach's channel. We are recording a video right after this. It's not live, but it's going to be coming out very soon, so make sure you go check out Zach's channel here at Apologetics. The link's going to be in the description below. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thank you for watching. God bless, and I'll see you next one, and goodbye.